John here. This is the Basic Expert, and this is part 3. We're going to go through spells a little bit. We're not going to go in depth into every single spell, but we're going to just do a quick little discussion about it, as well as equipment in Basic Fantasy role-playing game, which is kind of what I've been talking about for 2 weeks now. Did an introduction video. I suggest you go watch that as I kind of give an overview about what I'm going to be covering in the following weeks here, and what I'm supplementing the game with. And I also made a second video on character creation where we went through character creation, and I talked about the stuff that I'm using from the Rules Cyclopedia. And I'm just going to turn to the, should have done this before. I'm going to turn to the page where it is relevant here, because we're going to talk about equipment a little bit today, magic, and some aspects of the encounter or the adventure phase of your basic fantasy game. And we're going to go over and we're going to talk a little bit about it today. So sit back, relax, and let's dive into it. So on pages 10 and 11 of your core rulebook, now I should note that these pages are in reference to the physical book. The PDF is out of alignment, so if you type in page 10 on the PDF, it's not going to take you to what I'm referencing here in the physical book. So keep that in mind. And I didn't feel like adjusting it, sorry. But the book is so cheap, just get the real thing. You can outfit, like I've said many times, your whole table with books for much less than any 5e book or some other systems out there. So Basic Fantasy has a whole array of really awesome equipment that you could use. There's things like candles, lamps, thinking back to my 5e days, and it just goes to show how far a lot of this stuff has gone. A lot of this stuff is in the 5e book, but it's not used because not many people are running dungeon crawling, adventure, expedition sort of games, which I think are a lot of fun, and that's just at the core of what this game is really about in this particular setting. I mean, in first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, Gary Gygax talks about that, about how that's like the most common, the most stereotypical type of adventure you're probably going to run your players through, which is dungeon delving into some deep, dark, dank place full of scary monsters that want to kill them and eat them, and the players kind of hauling out loot and treasure, bringing it back into town, getting rich, using the XP, using gold as XP, one-to-one relationships so that they can level up, they can build their strongholds, they can invest it in a business. There's all kinds of different things. Hire henchmen and hirelings. That was a big part of old school D&D play, which just doesn't seem to come up as much in modern play. I don't hear, for instance, I hear of a NPC companion that is sometimes in with a group of modern gamers in their 5e adventure, but hiring 8 guys to go in the dungeon with you is something that you don't see much of. And then using morale and stuff like that, getting into the war game aspect. But I'm already going off tangent here, and we're not talking about what I really originally wanted to talk about. Henchmen is a different, that will be for a different video. We'll talk about that later. But within Basic Fantasy, you have lots of interesting stuff. You have backpacks, you have chalk, I've talked about iron spikes, I've heard of people using flour or sand, lots of different things that can help you, 10-foot poles that can help you in your dungeon expeditions. You're using the pole to kind of check for traps, you're tapping like floor tiles in front of you, poking walls, you're poking artifacts and things, seeing what happens. That's the usefulness of tools like that. Lamps and torches are incredibly important. I know that when I was first starting out, I didn't quite understand that, because I started playing before the hobby. It was bigger than it had been before, but it wasn't what it is now. And so I had to pick up the books and read them for myself and sort of interpret them based off of what I had absorbed through osmosis and pop culture regarding what Dungeons and Dragons was. This is back in the 4E days. And I had to sort of make an assumption, like the books explained what the game was, but even in those days, it didn't really talk about the importance of light torches, these sorts of things. At least I don't recall that aspect. It was kind of glossed over, and I think it's because that's not heroic, worrying about being scared of the dark and whatnot. But torches, all these other sorts of things, these are useful things that players are going to want to carry with them into dark, dangerous places. You also have a section on weapons here and armor. And in one of my last videos, we talked about descending and ascending armor class, and how I think Max from Legion of Myth said he talked to Chris Gonerman in one of my comments, in one of the comment sections there, which Legion of Myth is awesome. If you know about me, you probably know about Legion of Myth, but if you don't, go check them out. And he talked to Chris Gonerman, who's written Basic Fantasy, and Chris said that he took out Descending Armor class because he just didn't like the mathematics of it. It was hard for him, which I get. It seems kind of difficult for people to get a grasp on, it seems. I don't have too much trouble with it, especially if you're using Thaco, and I don't really find the first edition attack matrices all that slow or difficult to use. I think once you figure it out, it's not that bad. I mean, they used it back in the day just fine. It maybe is a little more obtuse, but it's not necessarily worse, in my opinion. It's a different flavor, in my opinion, just a different way of going about it. But if you want a quick sort of how does this work here kind of thing, I have a little formula here on the screen, assuming that because the unarmored is 9 in basic, old school basic. Unarmored was a descending armor score of 9. In Basic Fantasy, it's 11. And so for me, mathematically, what seemed to make sense is 20 minus 11 is 9, which is the descending armor class. So if you're using an old school module, the way I would do it, and you might be 1 point off of AC, I don't really think that's too problematic, especially when you're trying to convert on the fly. If you're using an old school, like original BX module or BECME module, you're running your players through. Just simply subtracting, so let's say you have a creature in front of you, subtract that creature's descending AC from 20, and you should have the ascending armor class that you can use in your Basic Fantasy game. And everything else should be relatively the same. You can even use this if you have like the Fiend Folio, or you plan on using, I don't have it in front of me right now, but first edition stuff, you can use it in Basic Fantasy and use this formula the same way. It should roughly be comparable and work. It's not going to be perfect. Again, I think there's 1 point of armor class that ends up getting muddled in all of this conversion. But if you're converting on the fly, to me, this seems to be the easiest way to work, and hasn't involved a TPK in my party just yet, so it seems to work for me just fine. If you want more equipment options, though, for your Basic Fantasy game, the Equipment Emporium is free as a PDF on the Basic Fantasy website. Link will be in the video description. Make sure you check that out. That offers a lot more options than just leather, chain, plate mail, and shield. It gives you bucklers, brigandine armor, all kinds of different stuff that you can kind of give a little more variety to your players, or offer enchanted versions of interesting things that aren't in the core rulebook as magic items, perhaps, as well, if you want to add a little enchantment to them or something like that. So I rather like that. And again, it's free. The PDF is free. I just went and printed up for my little GM binder the stuff from it that I personally particularly wanted, because I didn't pay for the whole print on demand book, which is at cost, but PDF's free. Just went, printed up the pages, particular pages that I felt were relevant, that I wanted, which was sentient magic weapons and the extra types of armor and weapons, just basic armor and weapons that are available to players. So make sure you check that out. Let's talk about magic. Magic is simple. If you're familiar with 5e, 5e kind of takes a very kind of BX/1e approach or 2e approach to magic, where in 4th they kind of got rid, I think they used, if I remember correctly because it's been so long, like daily powers and stuff like that. Like almost every class had their own magical, what was essentially a magical spell or spells that were available to them, and often they were available at level 1. Just seemed incredibly overpowered, I discovered over time running 4th edition games. But magic is simple. You have spell slots. We talked about that in our last video on character classes. There's whole in your progression charts for your class, there's whole for the cleric and the magic user, or if you're using druid or paladin or some other supplement class that is available for basic fantasy, it lists the number of spells that you have available to you at level 1, and as you advance, what spell slots become available. And casters, each caster class prepares them differently. Clerics do it through prayer, magic users do it through study of their spell books and tomes. I have a druid in our game who's using the supplemental druid class, and I just run it as cleric. So he gets it through meditating in nature and through communing with nature, much like how a cleric gets it through communing with their deity. And because everything else about how the basic fantasy druid class functions is pretty much how a cleric functions, their befriend animal skill or whatever is very similar to turn undead. So I just took it as that the spells are granted through prayer. The difference being that druids and clerics just have a smaller range of spells that are available to them. Obviously, magic users have to study and learn spells, but they get much higher level spells as they advance, and they have many more spells available to them than a cleric or a druid would. So that's what I personally do for druids if you plan on using the druid supplement, which is for free on the Basic Fantasy website. So spells must be prepared at the start of each day, and casters should tell their GMs what spells they have prepared for that day. The way I've heard some of this done is, players write down on a post-it note what spells they're preparing for that day, and they give it to the GM so that everyone's on the same page. I think if you have that seems like you're worried about cheating, and I think if you're worried about a player cheating on scribbling out one spell they have prepared instead of another because they feel like for this encounter they needed a different spell prepared than what they had, that's something you need to deal with on an individual basis. But it just helps for me to do something like that, even just verbalizing it, like asking them, it's a new day in the morning, Mr. Cleric or magic user, what spells are you preparing for today? And then they tell you, write them down, everyone's on the same page, and if there's a discrepancy later, you deal with it. When a spell is cast, the slot is expended, so that it's like a point, it's gone, and they forget how to cast that spell again. This is very Vancian kind of magic system. Someone in my last video had commented about they didn't like spell slots because they hadn't seen it in in literature or films or anything like that. It's actually very much inspired by the Vance novels, which you should check out. It's very similar where they sort of prepare it. I view it as almost like in the morning the cleric or the magic user is preparing mentally everything in their brain. They're storing up that magical energy inside their mind, inside their body, and it's like on a hair trigger, and all they have to do is say the magic word, do the magic hand gestures, and that's like pulling the trigger, and it's fired. And the magical energy, the magical preparation they did is left from their body. It's just wiped from it. The spell is cast, it just boom out of their body. That's kind of how I look at it. Like I carry every day when I go out. I carry my handgun, and it's like keeping around in the chamber. You don't want to spend time racking the slide in a self-defense situation. It's not going to end well for you. So it's kind of the same idea. So I don't have necessarily a problem with it. It's a simple magic system. Is it the best? No, there's probably much better magic systems out there. I rather like RPG Pundit's Invisible College magic system. I think that one's cool, but it works. It's fine. So unlike 5e and 1e spells, which have like the Basic Fantasy and the Rules Cyclopedia do not have verbal, somatic, and material aspects to those spells. It's all assumed that it's verbal and somatic, meaning they have to say a magic word and do hand gestures or body motions. The body is involved in movement in order to cast a spell, which is why in the basic fantasy rulebook, and I believe in the rules cyclopedia, it says that you must have at least one hand free and be able to speak in order to cast a spell. This is why binding a magic user and gagging them is often a good way of capturing them, keeping them from casting a spell, so that they don't do something like that. I think the visual, somatic, and material aspects are something that is somewhat pretty much ignored in most 5e games that I've seen. If you are stickler about that as a DM in your 5e games or in any other game that uses this sort of very common D&D magic system, good on you. You're doing better than most. Because I've seen it where it's just like, it's video gamey. Like the MMO, they click on the spells little skill icon and it happens, and they wait for the recharge the next day. Don't run your games that way. I don't think your players might think that's what they want. They want ease. They want to just be able to cast a spell and it happens, or do whatever they want. But the moment you allow that to happen, the game's gonna fall apart. The one thing I like that I discovered compared to 5th edition is that some spells are reversible. So, example, Cure Light Wounds can become Cause Light Wounds, Light can become Darkness. Reverse spells must be prepared that way. So a cleric, and so that's another thing too, a cleric that's preparing Cure Light Wounds, their deity might not grant them Cause Light Wounds. Maybe they're just like this healing good deity, and they're like, no, your job is to go out and heal. I don't grant you the reverse of that spell, and that's up to you as the DM to decide that, because the cleric might say, I wish to prepare that, and you have the right as representing the gods of that world of saying, the gods denied you the ability to cast Cause Light Wounds because that's not what your deity is about. And now the deity has you on notice, something like that. But I think casting reverse spells is really cool, and it's actually something in my 5e tenure as running that it's interesting that that's so much about giving players options, and that casting reverse spells is something that's just not covered in 5e, it seems. I don't recall that being in there, but again, it's been a while since I've ran a 5e game. And the last one I ran was Low Magic with Adventures in Middle Earth, which has no spellcasting classes, so there was no magic being cast to begin with back then when I ran that. So I think that's cool that spells are reversible. And I mean, if part of this video is if you're coming from 5e and you're interested in old school play and you want an entry point, that's partly why I'm making this video about basic fantasy, because it's free and it's going to be familiar to you. And so a lot of this is going to be familiar to you. It's just a matter of enforcing things that I see not being enforced in a lot of 5e games. So we get to the adventure and encumbrance. Encumbrance is something that I'm not personally very good about enforcing myself, but I think that it needs to be enforced, especially if you're doing a dungeon crawling kind of game where the players are going into some subterranean labyrinth and pulling loot out. It's going to affect the way they play the game if they can only carry so much on their person, and if they carry more, they're going to have issues in regards to movement and their ability in combat to be effective. So on page 36 to 42, start on page 36 here of the rulebook, you have rules for encumbrance, and this is after all the spells. You have rules for encumbrance, and I just think it's so important to enforce this rule. It might not be fun, but it gives you the charts here. Everyone has a base movement speed of 40, and then the armor you wear affects how fast and how far a player can move during their turn. And I just think encumbrance, again, they can only carry so much out, and the players have to think about, like, we're carrying all this loot. Do we need to carry it? Can we carry all of it, or can we take a penalty to movement in our combat abilities in case we get into a random encounter with a monster on our way out of the dungeon? Because we got to get this loot out, back to maybe where we can store it. Maybe we have a vault or a stronghold, or there's a bank in town where we want to deposit everything that we've or trade everything that we've got from this dungeon. And now we have to make choices, strategic, tactical choices about how much we're carrying, what items we're carrying, and then what do we do with the loot that we have left behind. It kind of makes me think of The Hobbit, where they kill the trolls, or they distract the trolls enough to where they turn to stone, and they find the troll lair, and it's like full of treasure, but it's more than they can carry, so they have to bury it for them to come back and get it later, and they just take what they can reasonably carry then. It's the same kind of idea, and I think it really changes the vibe, it changes the feel of the game, and the players might not like keeping track of encumbrance. You might have to do some bookkeeping on your end as a GM, but I think that that aspect is worth it, and it's not something to hand wave. And it's something, like I said, I'm not the best at. I need to get better at enforcing encumbrance, but I don't always do it. But I think that when it is enforced, it makes the game better. It just makes the game better. So use encumbrance rules. I know some people don't want to do it, especially modern players. I don't think I've ever played in a 5e game, and I didn't enforce it as a 5e player because I just didn't think that was, or DM, because I didn't think that's what my players wanted, and I was wrong. I was completely wrong about encumbrance. I think it's an important it's an important mechanic for dungeon delving, treasure looting sort of games that you might be running with. If you probably are running if you're running old school. Let's talk about vision, light, and mapping. Party members should be mapping the dungeon. Getting lost should always be a danger. This is where some of those other tools I talked about, such as chalk, flour, sand, or just one of the players being in charge of mapping the dungeon as the players move through it. That's always an important part. Getting lost should be an option. Don't hand wave them getting back into town. Getting into the dungeon and to the thing in the dungeon that they're seeking is the adventure. Getting out with it should also be part of the adventure as well, in my opinion. And getting lost, running into random encounters, all these other sorts of things are things that should happen potentially to players. Light is important. You should enforce light. Torches have a set amount of time that they can be that they can burn for. Dark vision or intravision, depending on what you're using, whether you're using intravision from actual old school D&D like first edition or the rule encyclopedia, or dark vision, which is what basic fantasy uses. Dark vision is black and white. Intravision is heat. Dark vision will not work in any light greater than moonlight, and obviously torches and things like heat sources, or if like a thief is hiding in the shadows from something that has intravision, if he's able to mask his heat, he's going to be invisible to that creature, even though it has intravision. So they have, I feel like intravision and dark vision have their pros and cons as far as to which one to use. I started my game as a basic fantasy rules as written game, and I've been incorporating rules encyclopedia and older edition D&D stuff into it. I think if I could do it again, I'd probably go with intravision over or infravision over dark vision. I kept saying intravision. I spelt it as intravision here. My bad. I would have used infravision over dark vision, but just because it seems like it could be more sneaky. You could be with creatures and how infravision can be messed with, but it's harder to keep track of it. I know a lot of people have complained about that, which is why the switch to just dark vision was made for a lot of creatures. But I don't know, it seems more interesting to me to use infravision. I think if I could go back, I would do that. Let's talk about doors and traps. So a stuck door can be forced open on a 1 on a d6. So if player rolls a d6 and they roll a 1, they will force open like a barred door or locked door if it's within reason. Like this is like a wooden door, maybe in the dungeon or to a house or something like that. They can add their strength modifier to the range. So if I have an 18 strength, I'm a super strong fighter, and I'm going to kick that door down, I have a 1 to 3 chance out of a d6 of breaking down that wooden door and getting through. forcing it open. If it's a metal door, it's a 1d10, and maybe metal bars, it can sometimes be done on 1d20. Traps are detected on a 1d6. This is where thieves are useful. So you have, like, I think he points out what that percentage is. It's 16.7 something maybe percent chance. Thieves have a higher probability chance, especially as they level up, of detecting traps with a very specific skill that they have in their thieves skills. So I would suggest that you use that as a thief. This is why I feel like the moving everything to a d20 has not been good for the game and skill checks. That, yes, it's probably annoying to roll percentile checks and understand that the thief or the ranger works completely different than the fighter as far as their skills are concerned, but it made it so that everyone's class served a very specific purpose within the dungeon expedition, in my opinion. So this is where thieves shine, is in detecting traps. Secret doors take a turn to find and are on a 1 on 1d6, but elves can find them on a 1 or 2, or a 1 to 3 if they have an intelligence of 15 or higher, according to the rulebook. So we've talked about encumbrance, we've talked about doors and traps a little bit. You can also have traps. I think there's a rule somewhere in the basic fantasy, I think when you can, in the back of the book, in one of the appendices or something like that, where it talks about different traps that you can do. You can have traps trigger on like a 1 on a d6. So like that always makes it kind of silly to me, because maybe the trap is a little stuck, and so the halfling thief walks over it first and he's like, I don't see a trap, it's fine. And the trap doesn't trigger for them. But as more people walk over it, you're rolling more often, there's a higher chance that that trap might, give way and trigger, and all of a sudden the spike comes out of the wall and it gets the wizard who was standing in the back, maybe because he thought he was safe back there. And really, it can mess with parties. I don't know. Maybe that's a little evil. I kind of like it that way, but I do that sometimes with my traps. But I've talked about traps, doors, encumbrance, spells. Another important part of your adventure in dungeons is to keep a strict record of time. I am a big advocate of strict time records. I think they're very important. I use this here from Old School Essentials. The link will be in the video description. I put it, if you've seen my DM prep update video where I have my binder, I stick this in there and I just use a dry erase marker on the plastic sleeve in order to mark how far they are into the dungeon time-wise. And as you can see here, the W's there stand for wandering monster checks. So every turn, I check, oh, it's a W, time to check for a monster, an encounter happens or not, check again, and then they have a rest period where they need to like stop and rest, and that's a 1 hour period. So each box here on this form is 15 minutes, I believe, or 10 minutes. They're 10 minutes because there's 6 of them. So each block there is an hour. So you're able to keep track of time, which is very important for checking for wandering monsters. Do rations need to be consumed? When is it time to rest and sleep? Because it's easy to wander through this dungeon, and if you're not keeping track of time-wise, really, because there are still time segments within combat encounters and moving through the dungeon. You might have had the players just like walking through a dungeon for a whole 24 hours and never called for them to rest, and they should be penalized for that, but they're not being. They're functioning as if they're perfectly fine. This is why strict time records are important, at least when you're dungeon delving, going through the dungeon. And so yeah, I use this Old School Essentials checklist, and I find that it really helps when I'm trying to roll for random encounters and stuff like that. And telling the players when it's time to rest in the dungeon too, where they have to rest for 10 minutes. And a wandering monster check occurs on there as well. So that's going to do it for this video. In the next video, we're going to go over henchmen, I believe. And maybe we'll get into some encounter stuff. I don't want to make each video too long. Let's see what's next. Retainers, wilderness adventures in the basic fantasy rulebook. retainers, specialists, and mercenaries. And then we get into the encounter phase, which we will start discussing at some point combat and how combat works. And you'll see why combat is a lot more deadly and dangerous than maybe your typical modern fantasy adventure game. So that's going to do it for this video. If you guys want to support my channel, please check out my subscribe star. I have 2 supporters on there, and I want to give a shout out to them. Mike D and GM Steelhaven, thank you for supporting me on there. It means a lot. I hope you enjoy the adventures that I'm putting on there and some of the content I'm trying to do there. And I'm open to suggestions of stuff that maybe you guys want to see for that as well. You can support me for as little as $1 a month or as much as $5. And $3 in the middle gets you an adventure a month, which is cool for you. You get a little OSR basic fantasy sort of centric, because that's the system I'm running. So I'm making adventures for what I'm running, which is basic fantasy. So, but if it's compatible with basic fantasy, it's going to be roughly compatible with almost any other OSR or classic D&D game that you're playing. So you're going to get an adventure and the sort of Roll20 compatible battle maps for those dungeons as well, in the old school blue dungeon tile set kind of look that was very common back in the day. I love blue dungeons. I love the blue dungeon look. So that's gonna do it for this video. Thank you guys for watching. Tell me in the video comments about how you run your basic fantasy game. Maybe do you keep strict time? Do you enforce encumbrance, or do you hand wave it? And what have been the results of how you've done that? I'm interested to hear what you all have to say. Until next time, guys, I'll talk to you later. Peace out.